Hey, just want to thank Steve Millington for the time he spent with us this morning. The plan is when I head out on vacation, which is a week yet to be named, Steve's going to handle. He's going to handle some of the days that I'm away. We've got a couple of other folks in mind. I've got to talk more in depth with them. I don't want to volunteer them before they officially say yes. But another former broadcaster who was on the show with us last week, I'm thinking would be great because he can talk from some well, he has a political perspective as well since he's serving an elective office. So we have a list of people who may be filling in at that point. And I've got to tell you what, a lot of these people are just naturals for what you do on the radio. It's 9:07. Bill Colley with you on Top Story 70. And of course, you're listening to News Radio 1310 KLIX, newsradio1310.com. We have all of these Supreme Court decisions coming down this week. They're just coming down one after another, and it'll be happening through Thursday, and then maybe even a couple trickle out early next week. The court is getting ready, though, to take off for its summer recess. That means Justice Thomas will be getting into his RV and driving across country, and you may actually see him camping out some nights in a local Walmart parking lot. It's how he likes to spend his time. I don't blame him. You get to see things, and with the RV, you don't have to worry about, a no vacancy sign somewhere. But I think that we'll see something as early as this hour coming out of the court. It may not be one of the big cases that everyone has been talking about. Do you realize this is the 10th anniversary of the Kelo versus Connecticut decision? Well, I think it was the city of, New Haven, Connecticut? It's one of those. New London, Connecticut, excuse me. What was that decision? Well, that was the decision that said that even though they weren't planning a road or a new school or a bomb shelter, that a local government could come through and use eminent domain, seizing your property to turn it over to a developer because the local government believes the developer will bring in more revenue. One of the most controversial cases in the history of the Supreme Court. It was a 5-4 decision at the time. They picked this up at Daily Signal today. All Suzette Kelo wanted was to live with a view of water. In 1997, Kelo achieved her dream with the purchase of a 900-square-foot Victorian home. Not a very big one, is it? Located in the Fort Trumbull neighborhood of New London. From her front porch, the mother of 5 boys could see the mouth of the Thames River. And on a clear day, she could see all the way to Montauk Point on New York's Long Island. But less than 1 year after moving to her piece of paradise, she found out the city wanted to take her waterfront property and others belonging to her neighbors. That was through eminent domain, and then the story walks you through what has happened. Well, the city did get the property after the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the city. Since then, though, most states in the Union have passed laws controlling the use of eminent domain by their own governments and by local governments within those states. It was such an outrageous decision. Even some of the justices who were involved in that decision now say, you know what, we goofed. So maybe there'll be judicial review someday, and we'll have another ruling, and with that will change that particular ability of government to seize your property to enrich campaign donors. Let's not sugarcoat this. When you take someone's property to turn it over to a large developer, the developer has usually been very gracious in writing checks to your campaign. Trust me, it happens. The city spent, this is in Connecticut, $78 million bulldozing the homes and preparing the area for development, but so far, all plans have fallen through. In other words, guess what? The city went through with this. It's a big empty field. Yes, there's a boat yard nearby and people are driving through. They put in some new roads and new sidewalks at great expense. But otherwise, nothing's happened there. So here you have this enormous vacant lot. They took out the entire neighborhood. Pfizer was already moving in with a plant nearby. That does exist. But the neighborhood is empty. No high-rises, no hotels, nothing. Now, I bring all of this up because it's related to something else we're talking about this week, and that is that Pacific Trade Agreement, the TPP as it's called, which the President of the United States is demanding that we have passage of. And, you've got the usual suspects in the House and Senate who've all said, no, bad idea, we're going to fight this over our dead bodies. And then, of course, well, all right, we've got a compromise. Well, okay. Well, all right, we've heard the clarion call of free trade. Well, all right, we're for it. Now, there are some people who will be holdouts. It crosses party lines. It definitely does. There are some Republicans all for it, some who are opposed. Our two U.S. senators, they're for it. On the other hand, if you go up north, Congressman Labrador is opposed to it. But he and his fellow Republicans who have been vocal about their opposition have been marginalized by the leader of their own party, John Boehner. And over in the U.S. Senate, there's all this talk about blood on the walls today, but they make all of these noises just to try to tell their various constituencies and special interest groups that, well, we did what we could, but we couldn't pull it off. Why are they so hell-bent on doing this? I heard Pat Buchanan on Sean Hannity's program about a week ago. Was driving through town one afternoon, had KLIX on my radio. Why wouldn't I? And I had it on the air, and Pat Buchanan said they're not paying attention to the constituents. The constituents, yes, can give them votes, but in order to get those votes, they have to get to the nomination. And in order to get to the nomination, they have to have a lot of campaign money. And that campaign money is coming from special interests who don't care that we hollow out this country when it comes to industry. And that's what the TPP is essentially, ultimately going to do. Do you remember the name Jesse Ventura? He was governor of Minnesota for a while. Before that, he happened to be a pro wrestler. Before that, he was a Vietnam veteran, served in the Navy SEALs, in fact. I met Jesse Ventura at a convention in Minneapolis in 2000. He was still governor in Minnesota. He spoke to our convention, the Radio Television News Directors Association, and I was chatting with him for a few minutes. My father had been a pro wrestler in the early 50s in Cleveland, Ohio, back when these wrestling circuits were regional circuits. They weren't national. And I was telling him that story, and I shared with him that the Army came along, and I said after the Army, I said that ruined my dad's wrestling career. And Ventura, the Navy veteran, said, "Yeah, the Army will do that to you." So he had a good sense of humor about some things. Ventura has a TV show. He also has a podcast that he airs. He's speaking on that podcast this week about the trade agreement. He also says if it passes, you may like this, he says if it passes, that he himself may decide to run for president. I don't know that he's going to have much traction, but he's issued the warning in his most latest comments.
It's called fascism. This is global fascism. By definition, fascism is when corporations take over government. Mussolini'd be so proud today. Can you imagine in his grave? He must be standing up and cheering for this fascist movement when they allow corporations to shape what trade will be throughout the world rather than allowing for actual human input into it.
And there was a long video. It's about 6 minutes long, and I saw a few minutes of it this morning before I happened to go on air. And he's answering a series of questions from a woman he works with. They're doing the video together. And at one point, she said, "You know what, Jesse? You're not a big fan of Elizabeth Warren. She's a U.S. Senator, uber liberal from Massachusetts." She said, "But Elizabeth Warren is opposed to this thing because of the secrecy, and it sounds like the two of you are exactly on the same page on this one. As we say, politics makes strange bedfellows."
Yeah, I agree with her because that would be the only reason they would keep it from the public. If they felt the public was going to agree with it, they would expose it to the public to get their agreement, which would make it easier then to move forward on it. So obviously the public would oppose it. That's why they're keeping it secretive.
Why do we have Republicans in Idaho who are backing this? Well, number one, Idaho is a big agriculture producer. And a lot of that agriculture simply goes straight down the river to the Pacific Ocean, and it goes overseas. So on the simple explanation is you have people in the U.S. Senate, Jim Risch and Mike Crapo, who back this bill because they look at it and say, okay, it's going to help a big part of my state's economy. We're going to be able to export potatoes and wheat and other, and you can even export milk now. I mean, it takes a little bit of, you got to store it in a particular fashion, but you can export that and you can get it over across the Pacific Ocean to people on the other side of the ocean who are hungry. And so the object is it's going to be great for the state of Idaho. But regionally that's true, but for a lot of states in this country, it's not going to be. And if Idaho is looking to attract, let's say, heavy industry ever again, this is not going to be the way to do that because more and more of that heavy industry from this country is going to be going overseas. And unfortunately, those are the jobs that used to pay really, really well in this country. They're not coming back. We keep being told, well, we'll have a service. I was in high school in the late 1970s when one of our teachers said, we'll be transitioning to a service economy. But a service economy does not pay the bills. If you think about that, I was growing up as a kid in western New York State, grew up about 50 miles south of Buffalo, New York. Bethlehem Steel was the big employer there when I was a kid. When I was in college, it closed. It closed. If you drove down Route 5 south of the city, there were miles and miles and miles of steel mills. I remember driving through there after the closure. Felt like I was in one of those movies about the end of the world and I was the only survivor. Big, empty, hulking plants, grass growing up 3 feet through the cracks in the parking lot. All of those jobs that were paying people the highest industrial wage in the history of the world vanished overnight in 1983. If they could find work, those guys ended up driving taxi cabs for $7 or $8 an hour until the immigrants came along and took the taxi cab jobs. And now you've got this thing called Uber, which is eliminating all of the taxi jobs. Now, in some instances, that's called creative destruction. When we have a self-checkout at the grocery line, yes, you may not have anybody any longer who's going to have a job checking out your groceries, but you've got a guy who's going to fix that machine. And so that is said that job will replace the one that happens to be lost. But we have not seen the majority of these jobs replaced. NAFTA came along and now the Pacific Trade Agreement. And folks, everyone talks a good game and says, trust us, trust us, trust us. But as Ventura said, if they can't tell you what's in it, why not? Because if they knew that you'd go, wow, that is really great, then they would have already revealed it, but they haven't. And so here we are, perhaps giving away the final remnants of this country. Also this morning, I don't mean to depress you too much, but I saw a video with Harry Dent. He's the economist who wrote a book 6 years ago saying we're in for a depression sometime in the next decade that will make 1932 look like a picnic. And he was joined in this video by David Stockman, who was the budget director in the early days of the Reagan White House. Stockman is an insider. He's not some guy who's out there. He's not a paranoid. He's not out there trying to frighten people. But he said, I'm on board with Harry Dent on this, and there's a whole hurtin' coming on, and it's going to be coming to this country quite soon. So this is why you have to ask those people. It's short-term, this trade agreement looks great for Idaho. But you've got to ask yourself, long-term, what's good for the country? That's why you need to contact those members of the House and Senate and say, when these things come up, you know what? I got to think about my children and grandchildren. No. But on the other hand, if you can't write them a big campaign check, you may not have much skin in the game whatsoever. 9:20, Bill Colley with you. 72 already this morning. The Raisin Cartel has been put out of business. We've got details on that coming up before the program ends. Hope you can stick around.